When it comes to knitting, difficulty can be a little bit of an ambiguous term because what is hard for one person can be a piece of cake for someone else, even on their first try. Regardless of where you are in your knitting journey, I really believe that any and all techniques can be achieved by any person as long as you commit to trying, making mistakes, and trying again. Let's go into this video with that mentality. For a while, once I got through like the basic knitting patterns and I could do most of the general basic skills, I gave myself a challenge to every new knitting project that I tried. I wanted to try a new technique, a new skill, something that I'd never done before in each and every project. Sometimes that meant that I would knit something that I never knit before, like the first time I knit socks, the first time I made a sweater, the first time I made something else. Sometimes it meant that there was an element in the design that I never tried before, or that there was a stitch in the design that I never tried before, or a skill in it. Regardless, I don't think this made me an expert, but what it did make me was really open to try new things and to at least try a lot of the techniques out there that are involved in knitting. Not all, but many of them. Some of them I never tried again, and some of them I got really into and I've been doing a lot ever since. Most importantly, it kept me very entertained and looking forward to my knitting project because there was always something new and something that I was learning. And even though sometimes that meant that I had to start over many times in that same project, it has taught me a lot, not just about knitting, but like in life, to always be open and try new things. And that's what I want to show you with this video. I want to tell you about some of those techniques that I try, some of which I am more familiar with than others, and some examples of projects about these techniques. So you could say that they are difficult, but like I said at the beginning, I think they're just different, new to you possibly. Some of them you're probably familiar with, some of them maybe you've never heard of before, but they're all just techniques. And I still maintain that even if you're newer to knitting, you can eventually get there, and you never know until you try. So give them a try. So based on my experience, I made a list of some of these techniques and I'm going to walk you through it. Again, the level of difficulty, I think it's going to be like a more advanced knitter, someone who has done garments before, someone who has experience with all of the basics, knitting, purling, increasing, decreasing, and that, feels comfortable with things like gauging your pattern before you start and different weights of yarn, different weights of needles, all of that stuff. Again, if you're still a beginner, it's still good for you to hear these terms or listen to this kind of advanced techniques so that you have something to look forward to, and that if you run into a pattern that has any of these, you know that you might need to try this skill before you really get into it. So let's get started with cables. And cables is one of everybody's favorite, and even people who have never knitted anything can probably identify cables, even if not by name. Cabling is actually, I would say, the easiest of all the techniques that I'm talking about, but one of the ones that looks the most impressive. Whenever people see projects that I've done with cabling, they always are like, wow, that looks so complicated. But cabling is actually not that hard. All it is knitting groups of stitches in different orders. So what you do is you have an extra needle called a cable needle, or even you can use just a needle, something to hold your stitches. And so your pattern is going to tell you how many stitches as you get to the cable, how many stitches you're going to put in that knitting cable. Then knit the ones after those stitches, and then bring those stitches that you had on hold back to your needle. And so basically you're crisscrossing your stitches and knitting them out of order. And that creates that kind of cabling, wavy shapes. And there's so many ways to cable. I mean, you can cable in front of your work, behind of your work, like bringing your needle behind and front. You can cable at different, groups of stitches, wide ones, small ones, and that's what creates all those different types of cables that you've probably seen in patterns before. And a single pattern can have many different types, and it's the way that they're mixed together that creates those like beautiful stitches that you've seen before. I say it's one of the less difficult ones, and yet it's in this list because people sometimes are a little like scared by it, because like I said, it's a technique that once it's finished, it looks really intricate, but it's actually not that hard to do. All you gotta do is like really pay attention and make sure that you don't drop stitches as you're cabling. Other than that, you're just following your pattern, and you just make sure that you're counting and have enough stitches to knit and the cables and all of that. But it doesn't come to anything more than that. So I think it's like an easy one if you want to look more advanced without actually having to learn something really complicated, is cabling. One of my favorite projects that I've made with cables before is the Botanical Pullover by Pearl Soho. And I like this pattern so much. I've made twice. I made 2 projects with it before, one for friend, one for me. I love this pattern because, again, it looks so beautiful and intricate, and I always get so many compliments on it. But it wasn't really that hard to make. I don't think this is like a really difficult pattern. Like, as long as you are very confident with knitting a garment and making sure that the garment's gonna fit you, I think anyone who has those skills can knit this pattern. And it is a gorgeous one. I probably would make it again. It was really fun to make. And yeah, it's just all those cables that form the yoke that give it like such a unique look. Another pattern that I've made that has cables in it is called Denali by Brooklyn Tweed, and it's a sweater for men. And this is my husband's favorite sweater that he wears all the time. And when I made it, you know, I wanted to do a lot of cabling. I was just like, I really wanted to do like the classic, almost like fisherman pullover with like all the cables, even though this is not fisherman's rib. But it does have 2 kinds of cables. And again, I always get all the compliments. People always say it looks so intricate, but it really is just cables and some purling in it, and that's it. It's just, that one has a lot of cables, so you just gotta pay attention to your pattern. Definitely not something that I can do without like actually putting all my attention into my knitting, but it is just counting and making sure I have the right amount of stitches in my cable and the right position, and that's it. So I think another one that looks very impressive, but it wasn't actually that hard. As for patterns that I want to make or that I recommend that I haven't made before, with a lot of cables. One of them is actually in my needles right now. I'm working on it at the moment. It's called the Minu cardigan. And this one has been taking a while just because the construction's kind of interesting. So it's definitely not an easy pattern, and it does have a lot of cables in it, but it also has another technique that I would touch on a little bit later. But of course the result is gorgeous, and I'm really looking forward to wearing this one when it's done. So there are tons of cable patterns out there. I recommend you start with maybe a simple one that only has like one type of cable. The next technique or skill, I don't really know what to call it, or maybe like just a type of knitting, is lace. And lace simply is type of knitting that uses the types of stitches that creates a lot of open stitches, or like wider type of stitches that, by being placed strategically, create a lace type of look to the knitting. And it's usually like very thin fabric and very airy, very delicate type of knitting, usually done, not always, but usually done with very thin fingering weight or lace weight fabric to like really enhance the look. And this one is tricky because, again, it's not like one way of doing lace. It's just about how you're placing certain stitches to create the look. So usually it's going to involve things like decreases and increases that you're increasing and decreasing in your same row, so that you create new stitches with that wider stitch look, and at the same time you're also decreasing because you don't want to have extra stitches. So the tricky thing about lace is usually like making sure you have the right amount of stitches and that you're putting those lace stitches in the correct place. It uses a lot of yarn overs and make one left or make one right stitches, and like I said, decreases. So lace is just complicated in the sense that you have to be familiar with all of these terms and all of these types of stitches, and you have to be very careful to follow the pattern precisely to make sure you're on the right row, that you're doing the right thing, because otherwise like one row of mistakes can just throw the whole pattern. So it just takes a lot of concentration, I would say, and like being careful with it and being careful with what you're making. Many times with lace, you're gonna find yourself looking at graphs rather than instructions. So you also have to be familiar with graphs, and it's just because it's so much easier sometimes to explain how a knitting pattern is going to be made in with all these different stitches if you see it in a graph than if you just write it out. So that's another thing that you should expect. In the end, I think lace, similar to cables, it's not that difficult. It just takes a lot of concentration and patience. It's less forgiving for mistakes, which is what makes it harder. I love lace. I just as much as I love cabling. I make a lot of lace type of patterns. I think it especially looks beautiful in shawls. Sometimes lace is not exactly what you think. Like it doesn't have to be like the old lady type of lace. It just is creating like shapes and patterns using all these different stitches. One of my favorite projects is the Mangrove Tee by Trust the Mojo, which is a summer tee, and it has that beautiful kind of repetitive pattern that looks like a leaf, and it's all created with lace techniques. So that's one that I love making, and it's not even finger and weight, so that goes to show that it doesn't have to be just finger and weight. I also recently, last year I think, I made the Guitar Top by Luna Knit, and I loved it so much. I want to make it again. It actually was, I didn't think it was that hard. I know it looks really intricate, but again, it's just a matter of paying attention to the rows that you're doing. And because it only has lace on the yoke part, once you finish that, you kind of just go stuck in it and you're pretty much done. So that was another really fun summer top that I made and that I want to make again. And as for other types of lace patterns that I would be interested in making myself, I really like the Clotilde cardigan by Knitting for Olive, which again is not the classic like super thin fabric. It's more of like, I think it is maybe worsted weight, I'm not sure. So there's all kinds of lace. Like you don't have to think of only one type of lace out there. And again, I think it's a little bit harder than cables just because you have to pay even more attention to what you're doing, less forgiving. But I think anyone can work with lace if you really, really just concentrate. Next, we got stranded color work. And color work in general is like another level because now you're introducing more than one color of yarn, and so immediately things get a little messy if you're working with two or even more colors, and sometimes people are scared of it because of it. The hardest thing with color work is always going to be keeping keeping your gauge and keeping your tension to be always the same, because when introducing a new color, it's very common to either knit really tight and have like stitches being pulled, or just having like uneven tension that gives like the fabric doesn't look straight. It doesn't look like one single fabric. You can really tell that the like different colors came in at different times. So that is kind of the tricky part. And honestly, my only advice for that is to practice. I remember my first color work project was a hat, and it ended up being so tight that it was too small for my head, so I couldn't wear it. So kind of practice and tell yourself you're not going to get it the first time probably, or you're going to have to, find a way to make it work. There's a few tricks that I can give you for color work, and I actually have a video that is very popular where I talk about tips and tricks for color work. There's a lot of things you can do. My number one tip is always going to be just practicing. But otherwise, you can try knitting. One of your needles can be a slightly larger size, and therefore, or in general, just knit with a slightly larger size than what the pattern is giving you, only for your color work, because that's going to allow you to have a little bit of like a looser tension, especially if you're like a really tight knitter. So that's an easy way of keeping organized. When you knit with stranded color work, basically what you're doing is just, depending on the pattern, you're using two or more colors. And so one very easy mistake is that you get all tangled up. So it's good to kind of keep the colors separate and always knit one color with one hand or with the other. There are certain techniques out there for color work where one of the colors goes on top and the other one goes under, and that will highlight one of the colors, and that just means knitting it from your left side or your right side. I also recommend, if you know continental knitting and English knitting, so throwing and picking, if you can do both, you can knit color work. Basically one color, one is picking and the other one is throwing. And that way you're knitting with both hands. It makes it a little bit faster. It also helps with the tension. So it's something to practice. So there's a few more tips in that video if you want to look at it. But again, it's just about practicing mostly. I have gotten so much better with my color work just because I've done so many color work projects lately. So for example, there's a festive joke pullover that I did, I think a year ago, or something like that, and it only has 2 colors, but it has a lot of color work, and just it's so much color work that I just did it, and I think it looked really good tension just because I'd done so much of it. I recommend, if you're not super familiar with color work, to stick to 2 colors and no more. And maybe you don't have to do like the entire something that has nothing but color work. You can start with something simpler or something that has less of it. So for example, my pattern, the Nochebuena pullover, which I released last year, only has color work in a section and it only uses 2 colors. So it's like an easy one to start with and to get familiar with knitting with 2 colors. Others that I want to make, there's so many beautiful colorwork yoke sweaters that I would love to make. I actually really like this cardigan called the Throwback by Andrea Mori. It's just like a really fun one, it looks like. And I like that there's more than one color. I always like the idea of playing with more than one color. And so that would be a really fun one to make. So if you're interested in color work, I definitely encourage you to try it and try to stay organized with the 2 colors. Try knitting with 2 hands and try knitting with larger sizes, and that's all gonna help you get better at it. Now, when it comes to color work, stranded is one of the most common ones that you see all there. It's also called Fair Isle, but there's also another technique called intarsia. And intarsia is a technique in which instead of going back and forth with colors and having like those floats behind your work, you're working the color in sections. And the problem with that is that if you don't know how to do it, or you don't know the intarsia technique, if you were to actually just knit with one color and then switch to the next without making sure that things are connected, then you end up with 2 separate blocks of knitting that are not really going to be connected. That's kind of the problem. It can come in handy for projects in which you have a large block of colors, more like, for example, those type of patterns where you have like 2 shapes and big colors, or more 3 shapes or whatever it is. Or sometimes when it's kind of like a rug color type of thing, you know, like what rugs have like bigger shapes in the garment. And basically the way that intarsia works is that when you are going to switch colors, you got to make sure that your strands of color are kind of intertwined before moving on to the next color, so that to make sure that you don't get that gap in which things aren't connected. I actually have a tutorial for this, so I'm going to link to that. So if you really want to learn intarsia and stranded color work, I do have specific tutorials for both of those techniques, so that no matter which kind you have to use in the pattern that you want to make, you can just refer to them and watch them however many times you need to understand how they work. One of the projects that I made using intarsia is called the Fable Sweater by Basketball and Knit. This one's such a fun kid sweater that I made for a relative, and it has like a little unicorn, and this is my first intarsia project, so that's how I learned how to do it. Then I also made a pattern of my own called a Spinster cardigan, and that one uses both stranded color work and intarsia, because you only have the color work in a certain sections. You gotta make sure colors are connected. So that's like a little easier way of picturing how that works. And again, I recommend watching the tutorials so that you really understand how those work. But in the moment you get into color work, things get a little complex. So I'm definitely would put these techniques in like the more advanced knitting. As for intarsia projects that I would like to do, there's this beautiful dress by Fable Knitwear called the Deco Dream dress. And it looks like so much work because I don't think I've ever knitted a whole dress. It's just like so much work. I can't even imagine. But it is gorgeous, and it has these very beautiful Art Deco kind of color shapes. And this is like one of my patterns that I'm most interested in making one day. So maybe I will. And it uses intarsia to create those blocks of color. Well, the next technique can be scary or sound scary for some people, just I don't know, because of the way it looks. Maybe you can't quite wrap your mind around it, but I don't think it's actually super hard. It's just simple stitches that together form a new thing, and it's brioche knitting. And what brioche is in knitting is not bread. It is a type of stitch that creates kind of like a squishy raised pattern and it uses yarn overs and knitting stitches together. So it's actually very easy, but I'm putting it here because I know a lot of people can be a little bit scared by it, and like maybe you've even done it and you didn't even know that you did, because you might have had brioche in your project, and it could make a pattern a little more complicated, because if you don't follow it right, or if you mess up in which row you are, because there's a 2-row combination, then maybe things won't be quite as right. So you do have to pay attention to that. But I think this one's actually not that difficult, and it's another one that looks more complicated, and it can create like really fun texturing into your projects if you learn how to do it. I've done it before, and I really recommend making a headband. There's this headband with a twist by Mirella Moments that is mostly just brioche, and then you just kind of twist it and sew it together. And so I think this is the best way of practicing this stitch, because all you do is create like a long rectangle of brioche, and if you mess up, it's really easy to start over and go back, because it's not that much knitting, and you can use your scraps to make it. So I really recommend trying this stitch with this pattern specifically. But if you want to see it in more like garment shape, I used the stitch for the Ribblesdale vest by Lily Kate France, and this was a pattern that it looks simple, was pretty fast, but it took me a long time because I made mistakes with the brioche and the counts, and so I had to start over. So again, it's not difficult, it's just paying enough attention and making sure you know where you're at. So the Minu cardigan that I mentioned earlier has cables and brioche, so that's why it's taking me kind of a while to do it, because it's like you really have to know what part of the pattern you're in, and like count your stitches and all of that. But I think this is another one that it's very fun once you get it. There's even 2-color brioche, which I actually have not tried this technique, and it's in my future want to try techniques, in which because of the way that the rows are set up, you can have color on one side and another color on the other. So it's not color work, it's different, it's still just brioche, and it gives a really cool like double-sided color effect. So I really recommend trying this one, even if you're a little bit scared of advanced techniques. This one's actually not that hard. And last but not least, this last technique is something that I've tried only once, and it was really exciting when I did. It is a technique that a lot of people can be a little scared of, and I was myself, because it involves cutting your yarn, your project. And of course, I'm talking about steeking. So steeking is just the name of the technique, in which you're usually doing it with colorwork, if not always with colorwork. And the reason you cut your project is because with steeking, you can knit your colorwork for projects with open parts, like cardigans or even like vests a lot. And I used it for a vest. And instead of, knitting back and forth and turning your work around for colorwork, you can do it, but it's a little harder and not always works, especially the more complicated or the more colors you have. So instead of doing that, you knit your project in one single piece, kind of leaving a little extra stitches in that spot where it's gonna cut. So if it's a vest, you just knit basically a tube, and then wherever those sleeves are gonna be, or in the case of a cardigan, the middle of the cardigan, it's same. You knit it in a tube, and then you're gonna go back and cut through that part, so that now you have an opening or wherever you needed, and that it was a little faster and easier to knit it because you were going just on the right side. So that's what steeking is in few words. It could be scary, because of course when you cut into your yarn, if you've ever by mistake done that, or if you unravel something, immediately things can unravel and get undone, and like you can lose your work. So of course this technique of steeking is more than just cutting into your yarn. You have to prepare your project for it, so you definitely leave special extra stitches with that space. And there's different techniques for taking care of those steaks, or that area that you're gonna cut. So of course it can be a little scary, and I was really scared the one and only time that I've used this technique. but the result was so worth it, and I think it ended up being good, and I think I would try it again for another project. And I'm talking about my Prince of Wales sleepover, which is a very popular video of mine. You can check that out, where I talk about steeking and I talk about colorwork, and like I'm gonna say this is one, if not the hardest project I've ever done, because of all the different techniques that it involved, because it was a men's size, it was bigger, it's quite complicated. So that was definitely, whenever people ask me like, what's the hardest thing you've ever knit, automatically I would say that one. It's also one of my favorite ones, and I would do it again, all over again. But it definitely it's a very specific technique. So if you're very into color work, I do recommend trying it out. But of course, you want to get really good at color work first. I wouldn't go straight into steeking. This is definitely something that takes a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of energy. And once you cut, obviously, you can't go back. So it's the one technique that you can't undo and try again. So you definitely want to at least test it out or feel very confident about what you're doing. So I would definitely place this into advanced and difficult. If I were to make another project that uses steeking, I probably would do the Ultra Joke cardigan by Scandier Knits. And there's a lot of cardigans out there that, you know, they have color work and then you use the steeking. So something like that. But I'm not in the rush of steeking and cutting my work anytime soon. So those are all the techniques that I recommend looking into if you're interested in advancing your knitting or getting to the next level. Or if you find patterns and you're like, what is this? If you see that technique in the pattern, now you know what it is. Please don't be scared of them. I think in the end, knitting is about fun, and I think trying things and challenging yourself, what's more fun than that in life in general. So I encourage you to try, and in the end, like, I've only been knitting for 10 years, so I would not have been able to do this 10 years ago. I think it's really just a matter of practicing and trying and failing and doing it again and never giving up. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will be back soon with more. Make sure to follow, subscribe, and all of those things. And let me know if there's another technique that you think is really hard, you've never tried, and you would like to see me talk about in the comments. Happy knitting!